In a move that shocked global markets and sent political analysts scrambling for insight, the year 2025 saw an unprecedented alliance between two historically unpredictable allies, the United States and Pakistan. The ink on the agreement was still drying when oil prices fluctuated overnight and rival nations began emergency briefings. The world hadn't seen such a quietly explosive deal since the post-Cold War energy rush. But this wasn't just about barrels and pipelines. This was a deal rooted in decades of mistrust, regional instability, and covert diplomacy. It began not in Washington or Islamabad, but in a remote, windswept region of Balochistan, where American geophysicist Dr. Alan Firth, working on a private research grant, accidentally confirmed seismic readings indicating an enormous oil basin stretching across the Makran coast. Hidden beneath decades of sand, tribal conflict, and political obscurity, Pakistan's untapped oil reserves were far more vast and valuable than anyone had previously estimated. The discovery was quietly reported to the U.S. Department of Energy. Within weeks, black-suited men flew into Islamabad under the radar of international media. What followed was a whirlwind of midnight meetings, hush-hush helicopter visits to remote drilling sites, and backdoor conversations with Pakistani military and civilian leadership. Pakistan, battered by inflation, external debt, and energy shortages, was at a crossroads. For decades, it had relied heavily on Gulf states for fuel and the IMF for bailouts. But this was different. This was sovereignty, wealth, influence. For the first time, Islamabad saw a path to escape the shadow of its historical dependency. The pact was officially signed in April 2025 under the guise of an energy cooperation framework. But what the sanitized press release didn't say was that the U.S. had secured exclusive drilling and refining rights in 3 massive oil-rich zones in exchange for technology transfers, infrastructure development, and perhaps most controversially, geopolitical shielding from rival regional powers. Within days, satellite images confirmed the presence of high-security American facilities in Gwadar and the interior districts of Balochistan. Protesters erupted across neighboring countries. China, heavily invested in the region through its Belt and Road Initiative, issued a vague but ominous statement warning against foreign manipulation of regional resources. Russia called it a neo-imperial move. But it wasn't just about the oil. Intelligence analysts whispered that part of the deal included advanced surveillance technology sharing, possibly even access to certain NSA cyber tools by Pakistan's ISI. That alone sparked panic in New Delhi and Tehran. Meanwhile, American companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron saw their stocks soar as the market digested the reality that the U.S. had just secured a new and stable source of crude, untouched by OPEC quotas and situated along a key naval route. The Biden administration, nearing the end of its term, hailed the deal as a masterstroke of 21st-century diplomacy. But not everyone was celebrating. Deep in the tribal regions, resentment boiled. Local leaders, who had never tasted the profits of Pakistan's limited past oil projects, feared being steamrolled by multinational corporations and foreign military contractors. Small militias began forming, claiming to protect ancestral land from Western invaders. Reports of sabotage and attacks on early-stage drilling equipment began circulating, though none were confirmed officially. Back in Washington, classified documents revealed a curious clause in the agreement, an emergency military cooperation trigger. If Pakistan's oil fields were ever threatened by external or internal hostile actors, the U.S. could deploy security assets without prior approval from the Pakistani parliament. It was the kind of clause that screamed neo-colonialism to some and strategic genius to others. Pakistan's prime minister, in a televised speech, promised that this deal would usher in a new economic dawn. Roads were being built, thousands of locals were promised employment, and educational scholarships were suddenly abundant for petroleum engineering students. But the opposition party accused the government of selling the country's soul for a quick payday. As oil began flowing by August 2025, the global energy balance shifted. Gulf oil lost leverage. U.S. refineries started producing a new blended crude from the Pakistani basin that was both cheaper and cleaner. Europe, still recovering from energy insecurity post-Ukraine conflict, rushed to sign import deals. Even Japan and South Korea lined up for long-term contracts. But as the world adapted to this new reality, an anonymous whistleblower leaked internal U.S. cables that hinted at something far more sinister. Allegations that the U.S. had known about Pakistan's reserves since the early 2000s but had suppressed the information to avoid global competition. Conspiracy theorists had a field day. And somewhere in the shadows, a new threat was emerging. one not driven by ideology or religion, but by a deep, generational hatred of foreign control and broken promises. The oil was flowing, the money was growing, but so was the danger. One rainy night in Quetta, a high-ranking official in Pakistan's Ministry of Energy was found dead in his home. The official report cited heart failure, but those close to him whispered of encrypted flash drives and frantic calls to journalists hours before his death. Within 48 hours, multiple field engineers working on the Gwadar pipeline project mysteriously resigned and disappeared. The Oil Pact, once hailed as Pakistan's golden ticket to economic revival, was now drenched in suspicion and paranoia. In Washington, the National Security Council convened an emergency meeting. Satellite imagery had picked up unusual heat signatures in the Khoe Sultan region, suggesting underground bunkers, weapon stockpiling, or worse, the return of a fragmented but deadly insurgency. Intelligence chatter pointed toward a shadowy new alliance of ex-Taliban fighters, disillusioned tribal warlords, and rogue Pakistani military officers. They called themselves Sarmakars 2025, a resurrection of the old Baloch separatist ideology, now repackaged as a high-tech, anti-globalization resistance. American security contractors were dispatched under private licenses. But what happened next stunned even the most seasoned Pentagon advisors. A drone convoy carrying vital oil samples to a U.S. military lab in Bahrain was hijacked electronically midair and brought down in the mountains of Shagai. The technology needed to pull off such a feat was beyond any known regional insurgent group. The U.S. began quietly suspecting foreign interference, perhaps a sophisticated cyber attack courtesy of a nation-state competitor. Meanwhile, in Karachi, an exiled Pakistani journalist named Zoya Ahmed released a damning report titled Crude Lies, the Pact That Broke a Nation. It was loaded with leaked documents, secret meeting transcripts, and internal memos showing that only 3 families in Pakistan, each closely tied to the ruling elite, were set to receive 80% of the royalties from the new oil zones. Public fury ignited. Massive protests erupted in Lahore and Peshawar. University students marched, burning effigies of both Pakistani and American leaders. Some even called for the impeachment of the Prime Minister. To calm the situation, Washington pushed Islamabad to make cosmetic reforms, offering token investments in local clinics, schools, and water purification systems. But the damage was done. The perception of an unequal deal had poisoned the well. And the insurgents weren't waiting. In mid-September 2025, a coordinated attack hit 3 separate drilling sites simultaneously. Highly trained commandos, masked and equipped with state-of-the-art gear, neutralized security, took over rigs, and live-streamed their takeover with the caption, "Your freedom runs on our blood." The world watched in shock as flames erupted from pipelines, the very symbol of American-Pakistani cooperation turning into pillars of black smoke. Oil futures spiked. Insurance companies pulled out. Investors panicked. And in a single week, over $20 billion in projected revenue vanished from Pakistan's future. The military retaliated, launching a brutal counteroffensive in Balochistan. But every strike only further fueled the insurgency, which now had sympathizers as far as the Pakistani diaspora in London, Toronto, and Dubai. Back-channel diplomacy between the CIA and ISI grew tense. Trust eroded. And rumors began swirling that a faction within Pakistan's army, disillusioned with the West and eager to restore national dignity, was planning to annul the deal entirely. But here's where it took an even darker turn. Just as global pressure mounted and the oil pact teetered on the edge of collapse, an anonymous whistleblower from inside the U.S. Department of Defense dropped a file onto a dark web platform. Codenamed Project Echelon, it detailed a parallel mission run by a covert American unit tasked not just with resource extraction, but with monitoring and manipulating local political dynamics through AI-driven propaganda, psychological profiling, and covert blackmail. The files revealed biometric scans, intercepted private conversations of key Pakistani officials, and simulated models predicting civil unrest with eerie precision. It was a geopolitical bombshell, and once Pakistani media got hold of it, everything exploded. The government declared a state of emergency. American diplomats were expelled under accusations of espionage. Protesters stormed a U.S.-funded research center in Islamabad, tearing down its walls with bare hands. Meanwhile, the insurgency now had a moral victory to fuel their narrative. The West never came to help, their leader announced in a pirate radio broadcast. They came to colonize in suits, not uniforms. As winter approached, Pakistan stood at a crossroads. Billions had been lost. National pride was in tatters. And beneath the soil, the very oil that promised prosperity was now soaked in secrecy, sabotage, and spilled blood. But somewhere in Virginia, behind the shatterproof glass of a Langley office, a senior CIA analyst clicked through the chaos with cold calculation. "It's not over," she muttered. "It's just phase 1. 3 weeks later, a quiet meeting unfolded in Geneva under the guise of an International Energy Stability Forum. But no press was allowed in, and no photos were released. Seated behind closed doors were envoys from the US, China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and in a stunning twist, 2 men representing Pakistan's military intelligence, neither of whom had official government titles. What was being discussed wasn't public cooperation. It was a race to control the future of South Asia's most volatile new oil frontier. The Americans offered reassurances. The deal with Pakistan was still valid. But the Chinese delegation had come prepared. They revealed high-resolution satellite footage showing U.S. drones monitoring not just oil fields, but Chinese-built infrastructure near the CPEC corridor. It was an indirect accusation that the Pakistan Oil Pact was not only about oil, but a strategic bid to undercut China's Belt and Road Initiative. What no one knew, at least not yet, was that deep inside the Balochistan hills, the insurgents had stumbled upon something extraordinary. An ancient, abandoned Soviet-era tunnel system stretching for miles underground, filled with rusted weapons, encrypted files, and in one section, massive metal drums sealed and stamped in Russian. No one knew what they contained. But the Sarmakars had found them, and were calling them the ghost caches. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Harris's administration was divided. One faction argued for cutting losses, pulling out before the conflict escalated into a regional war. Another, led by a charismatic State Department undersecretary named Philip Crane, saw it differently. "We hold a loaded deck. All we need to do is bet smarter." Crane secretly initiated Operation Lighthouse, a psychological warfare campaign designed to fracture the insurgency from within. It used deep-fake videos to fabricate betrayals among Sarmakar leaders, AI-generated audio recordings of their commanders allegedly selling out to foreign powers, and ghost accounts flooding encrypted channels with propaganda. For weeks, it worked. Factions turned on each other. Mistrust soared. A key Sarmakar field leader was executed by his own men, on suspicion of being an American asset. But the insurgents weren't naive. One of them, a former cybersecurity professor from Karachi turned rebel, reverse-engineered the AI footprints and exposed the entire operation in a live feed viewed by over 9 million Pakistanis. Trust in the U.S. collapsed completely. Simultaneously, oil output dropped to less than 30%. Workers refused to report to sites. Foreign engineers demanded evacuation. And then came the unthinkable. A Pakistani Air Force colonel, one with known nationalist leanings, commandeered a small drone fleet and launched a preemptive strike on a U.S.-controlled oil processing hub in Gwadar. Though casualties were minimal, the symbolism was unmistakable. Pakistan's own military had turned its guns on the agreement. The U.S. responded with sanctions, freezing billions in aid and suspending all joint military training. But Pakistan wasn't alone this time. Iran stepped in with promises of fuel imports. Russia offered arms. And China, smelling opportunity, brokered a secret trilateral pact with Islamabad, oil infrastructure for loyalty. By early 2026, Pakistan announced it was re-evaluating all Western energy contracts. American firms were given a 60-day notice to halt operations. Riots flared again. Sarmakar flags appeared in places they had never been before: Karachi, Multan, even parts of Islamabad. Behind the chaos, a darker truth was emerging. An international journalist working for a Scandinavian outlet published a damning exposé: the pact never meant to succeed. The article presented leaked documents from a black budget program detailing that the oil pact had a dual purpose: not just energy acquisition, but destabilization of regional alliances. The goal? To fracture China's strategic partnerships by drawing Pakistan closer to the West, and to ignite internal divisions that would weaken the military-political grip of Beijing-friendly governments. It almost worked. But they underestimated the fire they lit. Now, the region teetered on the brink of a proxy war. Chinese naval presence intensified in the Arabian Sea. The U.S. fleet in Diego Garcia was placed on high alert. Israel quietly offered electronic warfare support to the U.S. Pakistan hinted at buying Iranian oil using digital currency to dodge sanctions. The rupee collapsed. Inflation hit 78%. A loaf of bread in Lahore cost more than a full tank of fuel before the deal. But in the midst of chaos, one unexpected player emerged, a new civilian-led political movement, composed of students, technocrats, and middle-class workers who demanded an end to both foreign exploitation and insurgent violence. They called themselves Hakiki Pakistan, the real Pakistan. Their slogan, neither east nor west, only us. Their rallies began small. Then they filled stadiums. For the first time in years, Pakistanis began dreaming of a third path, free of puppet governments, foreign agendas, and false promises. But movements that grow too fast are rarely allowed to survive. And as the CIA and ISI both began infiltrating Hakiki Pakistan's ranks, its young leader, Sara Qureshi, a former Oxford scholar turned activist, found herself in a deadly game that would determine not only the future of the oil pact, but the very sovereignty of the nation itself. Sara Qureshi stood at the edge of a rooftop in Rawalpindi, her voice trembling not from fear but from the weight of what was about to unfold. Below her, thousands of supporters chanted her name under the floodlights. The air buzzed with anticipation, hope, and something darker, surveillance. She knew they were watching. Maybe from the crowd, maybe from satellites overhead. Maybe both. Earlier that day, she had received a message slipped under the door of her apartment. A single phrase typed on a torn piece of paper. Your father didn't die in an accident. Her father had been a retired air commodore, a respected voice in military circles who had mysteriously died in a vehicle malfunction in 2017 after criticizing Pakistan's overdependence on foreign powers. Sara had believed the official story, until now. Inside her jacket, she carried a USB drive. It contained hours of audio, recordings her father had made before his death. In them, he spoke about a clandestine committee composed of Pakistani elites, foreign diplomats, and shadowy business tycoons that had been quietly controlling state policy since the early 2000s. Their name, the Crescent Consortium. The Oil Pact. It was their crown jewel. It wasn't just a bilateral agreement. It was the activation of a long-planned extraction blueprint drawn up nearly 2 decades ago in anticipation of global energy collapse. The U.S. was merely the latest buyer. The real sellers had always been within. Sara's speech that night was not written down. It came from a place beyond politics, a deep ache to rip the curtain down. We are not pawns. We are not rebels. We are not a pipeline. We are a people. And starting tonight, we say no more. The crowd erupted, but in the nearby hills, a group of silent figures observed through infrared binoculars. One of them, a man with a scar down his cheek and a U.S. Special Forces patch hidden under civilian clothes, pressed his earpiece. She has the drive. Target confirmed. Awaiting directive. But the directive never came. Because, somewhere in the Pentagon, someone higher up had pulled the plug. The public mood had shifted too far. Social media had made Sara a global icon. Even American citizens were questioning the ethics of the oil pact. Hollywood celebrities, journalists, and rogue U.S. senators began trending hashtags in her name. She had become untouchable, not by politics, but by narrative. Still, not everyone respected optics. Just 3 nights later, a blackout plunged half of Islamabad into darkness. Simultaneously, an explosion rocked a Hakiki Pakistan headquarters in Lahore. 27 were killed. The official story blamed it on the Sarmakars. But encrypted whistleblower channels claimed otherwise, that the hit had been ordered not from within Pakistan, but from Langley as a deniable measure. Sara survived. Barely. Her car had been rerouted by a loyal driver who ignored GPS instructions, because he felt something was off. As she recovered in hiding, a global shift began to form. In Brussels, the EU Parliament tabled a motion to investigate neo-resource colonialism and cited the Pakistan Pact as a case study. In Beijing, Chinese state media offered Sara a platform to speak. She declined. In Moscow, RT aired a full-length documentary on the Pakistani awakening. All of it framed Sara as a revolutionary hero. But it wasn't fame she wanted. It was justice. And justice required proof. She released the audio files her father had recorded. one by one. Every Friday. Each one naming names, politicians, generals, executives, and American officials. She showed meeting logs, offshore accounts, and secret equity ownership of the drilling rights, hidden under shell companies registered in Mauritius, Dubai, and the Cayman Islands. One file caused a seismic shift. It contained a recorded phone call between a former U.S. ambassador and a Pakistani minister. Just keep the unrest below CNN levels, and you'll get your bonus when the first tanker hits Houston. The leak led to an investigation by the New York Times, and soon after, a congressional hearing was scheduled in Washington. The scandal was now global. But the consortium wasn't finished. They issued a private bounty, $10 million for Sara, alive. $2 million, dead. The Sarmakars, sensing an opportunity, offered protection. They proposed a deal. In exchange for sanctuary in the tunnels, Sara would publicly endorse their struggle. But Sara refused. She saw through them. They didn't want freedom. They wanted power. Instead, she reached out to someone no one expected. Major Reza Ali, a decorated ISI officer who had resigned in disgrace years ago after exposing corruption in a weapons procurement scandal. He agreed to help, but warned her. They won't just silence you. They'll erase you from history, like they did your father. You need to hit them where they can't recover the money. That's when Sara initiated Project Barzak. Working with anonymous hackers from Europe, rogue analysts in New York, and even disillusioned tech workers from Dubai, Project Barzak began exposing the offshore networks that held consortium funds. One by one, accounts were frozen. Asset seizures began. A ripple turned into a tsunami. But the consortium had a final card to play. A viral video surfaced showing Sara allegedly meeting with an Israeli intelligence officer. It was a deepfake, but convincing. Pakistani media went into overdrive. Clerics condemned her. Protesters burned effigies. The Hakiki Pakistan movement fractured overnight. Sara vanished. For 29 days, the world heard nothing. Until one morning in January 2026, a live stream appeared on every major social media platform. Sara Qureshi, standing atop a massive hill overlooking the burning remains of an abandoned oil facility, flanked by hundreds of workers and former soldiers. You wanted a war for oil. We'll give you a revolution for freedom. She smiled, then pointed behind her, where a newly painted flag waved in the wind, a white crescent on green, over a blazing oil rig split in half. The movement was reborn. And this time, it wasn't asking for permission. Sara led a united nation, burying the pact's ashes beneath reclaimed soil, Pakistan's freedom sealed in fire, not fear.